The Book of Joshua, fully summarized. With Moses now dead, Joshua was promoted to God's loyal servant, and God told him not to be afraid, for as long as he was with him, no man could stand against him. Joshua was to tread upon all the inhabitants of the Holy Land, and divide it up for the Israelites, and follow God's laws in all things. So Joshua ordered the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh to come up with him and attack the nations dwelling in the land, as they promised to do, along with the rest of Israel. So they heeded Joshua's command and said that anyone who rebelled would be executed. Joshua began to organize the Israelites in their attack on Jericho, and had them prepare provisions. He sent 2 spies to gather information on the land, and they met up with a prostitute named Rahab, who gave them shelter. Apparently these spies weren't all that stealthy, since they were quickly discovered, and the king of Jericho sent men to the brothel to grab them. But Rahab hid them and did not turn them in. She told them that she knew that the Lord had given them the land, and she had heard of their great exploits at the Red Sea and the horrific destruction they were capable of. She made them promise to spare her and her family from the destruction that was to come. So the spies made a covenant with her that she and her family would not perish in the ensuing bloodshed as long as they hid in her house, and she tied a scarlet cord in the window so Israel would know not to attack her. Israel then prepared to do battle after the spies returned with tales of Jericho crapping their pants in fear of them. And the officers of Israel went through the camp and commanded the Israelites to follow the Ark of the Covenant, being carried by the Levites, but to not get too close to it. Joshua told Israel that God would without fail drive out all of Israel's enemies before them, and then the priests holding the ark made the Jordan River part ways temporarily, as the Red Sea did when they touched the water, and all of Israel crossed over the Jordan together. Then, after everyone had crossed the Jordan, God had Joshua get 12 men from each tribe to take 1 stone each from the river and put them in the lodging place of Israel, where they camped, so that they would always remember how God cut off the waters of the Jordan and would fear him. Joshua was exalted by God in front of Israel, and after standing in the middle of the river waiting for everyone to cross, the priests who bore the ark went on to dry land, and the river flowed once again, and the 12 stones were placed in Gilgal. The Amorites and Canaanites heard of the Jordan River drying up and were afraid of God's power. Then a new generation of Israelites were circumcised at the Hill of Foreskins. Oh, my ball, they actually called it that. With flint knives by Joshua at the command of the Lord, because all those who had been circumcised before died on the trip to the Promised Land, and the young generation had not been circumcised yet. So the Israelites camped in Gilgal for some time, and after they healed, they kept the Passover, with unleavened bread, of course, #GodHatesYeast. Then later, a guy came up to Moses claiming to be an angel commander of the army of the Lord, and Joshua fell on his face before him. The angel told Joshua to take off his shoe because he was standing on holy ground, which he did. So anyway, Jericho was pretty fortified because they were preparing for a siege, but God gave instructions that the priests were to march around the city with warriors each day for 6 days and sound the trumpets. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and after that, when Israel shouted loudly, God would destroy the walls of the city. Joshua commanded the priests to do as God commanded, and after the Israelites shouted, the wall came down. Joshua commanded the Israelites to destroy everything and kill every living thing in the city except for Rahab and her family, who probably should have been killed since according to the book, their house was supposed to be part of the wall that collapsed, but whatever, and to take all the precious metals from the city for treasury of the Lord, because he needs his bling. But abstain from any of the accursed items and don't take anything for yourself. So Israel carried out Joshua's orders to the letter and killed every man, woman, and child and animal in the city, except for Rahab and her family, who were taken out of the battle and dwelled in Israel afterwards. It is weird, though, because I seem to recall in the previous book Moses said that prostitutes were an abomination and have no place in Israel. She aided and abetted a genocide. I guess she gets a free pass. Joshua cursed the man who would ever rebuild the city of Jericho, and people listened to him because he was now feared throughout the country. However, one of the Israelites, Achan son of Carmi, partook in unholy booty, and this sin was brought upon Israel. Joshua then sent men from Jericho to spy out the country of Ai, and they returned to him and said that they would only need a few thousand people to conquer it. However, they were defeated and fled from Ai, so Joshua tore off his clothes, fell on his face, and put dust on his head, and asked why God had forsaken them and caused them to lose their battle. The Lord told him to get his face off the ground, and that Israel had sinned and disobeyed him by stealing some of the accursed items from Jericho, aka the unholy booty as previously mentioned, and Israel would not be able to stand in battle unless the one who took the accursed items was burned along with the accursed items and all their possessions. So then Joshua rounded up all of Israel to determine the culprit at the Lord's command, and Achan confessed to taking a beautiful Babylonian garment as well as gold and silver. He was brought out along with his family and livestock, and they were all stoned to death by the congregation and burned afterwards. And then God, who was on their side again, told Joshua not to fear and to go into Ai, and did as they did to Jericho. Joshua came up with the plan of drawing the soldiers out of the city of Ai with 30,000 men and ambushing them. The plan worked, as Israel fled before the men of Ai when they came out to meet them, and every single man in Ai followed them, leaving the city completely defenseless. 5,000 Israelites lying in wait then burned it to the ground under Joshua's leadership. The men of Ai, who left the city to chase after the Israelites, were in total panic mode and were attacked by Israel on all sides, and so the Israelites slaughtered every single soldier in the battle except for the king, who was taken to Joshua and then later hanged on a tree. And everything in the city was slaughtered except for the livestock, which Israel took for itself. Joshua then built an altar of stone to the Lord to thank him for making their enemies so easy to slaughter, just as he had commanded Moses. And he made offerings on it and read every letter of Moses' law to all of the Israelites. So later an alliance was made among the different kings of the Holy Land to fight against Israel, but the Gibeonites worked craftily and sent men to make a covenant with Joshua instead. They deceived Joshua, telling him that they were from a faraway land, and flattered him and spoke of his great strength and the strength of the Lord. And they said they wanted to be Israel's servants. So, without asking God's permission, Joshua made a treaty where they would be their servants, in return for sparing their lives, because they greatly feared Israel. However, Joshua then found out that he had been duped, and the emissaries were not from a faraway land, and were in fact residing in the Holy Land. Israel had to spare them now to avoid going back on their word, but Joshua was pissed that they lied, and now Israel wouldn't get to slaughter them like God promised. Joshua then vowed that the Gibeonites would be condemned to slavery and servitude for the rest of their days. Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, feared Gibeon, though, as well as Israel, and sided with 4 neighboring cities to destroy Gibeon. Thus the 5 kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon gathered together and camped against Gibeon and prepared to go to war. Men of Gibeon went to Joshua and told Israel to honor their agreement and save them, and the Lord was with Joshua, so the Israelites quickly slaughtered the adversaries to save Gibeon. The Lord killed the fleeing survivors with hail and froze the sun and moon in the sky for a day, so it wouldn't get dark until the slaughter was complete. Talk about daylight savings time. The 5 kings escaped and hid in a cave, but were found, and then they were killed by Joshua and hanged, and were buried in the cave that they hid in, which was sealed with a large boulder. So then the chapter tells of how, with the help of God, Joshua slaughtered and ransacked every other city in the hills, and the south, and the vale, and the springs, one by one, leaving nothing remaining and killing everything that breathed. Then Jabin, king of Hazor, being understandably terrified of these genocidal invaders, sent messengers to many other kings to form an alliance which went up against Israel to fight. But God told Joshua not to be afraid. They were all defeated quickly because God was with Israel, and they slaughtered every single soldier. Then Joshua killed King Jabin, and had the Israelites kill all the other kings in the region, as well as every single person. They burned the cities, killed the horses, but took the livestock plunder for themselves. No one was spared from Israel, except for Gibeon, because the Lord hardened all the other leaders' hearts so that they would not surrender, and Israel would have an excuse to slaughter them all. At last, the Anakim giants were destroyed in the land, and only remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, and Joshua gave the conquered land as an inheritance to Israel. The next chapter then goes on to list all of the kings that were slaughtered by Moses, and then goes on to state all of the kings slaughtered by Joshua. There are a lot of them. Joshua was now old and frail, but God told him that there was still much work to be done. The next chapter goes on to state all of the land and its boundaries that has yet to be conquered. There's a lot. And how it would be provisioned for the Israelites after they drove out everyone in the land. The chapter then explains the boundaries of the land east of the Jordan for Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and how it was conquered and from who, for about a page, but the Levites still don't get any inheritance. #Justice for Levites. In the next chapter, Israel divides the land in Canaan by lot, and then the children of Judah came up to Joshua in Gilgal. Caleb, the leader of the tribe, told Joshua that he was the only other spy aside from him who brought back good news to Moses about the promised land, and so Moses blessed him and said that wherever he stepped he would inherit. Thus Joshua gave him and his sons the land of Hebron as an inheritance. Then the next chapter lists out all of the land now belonging to Judah, which dwelled on the west side of the Jordan, there's a lot, and states the exact boundaries of their land. Then Caleb went up to the inhabitants of Kirjath Sepher, and said that whoever attacked the land and took it would have his daughter Aksah as wife. So Othniel, Caleb's nephew, did so, and got to marry his cousin, and she persuaded her father to give her some land as an inheritance. So then the chapter lists all of the cities belonging to Judah, and there are a ridiculous amount of them, but they were not able to drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem, so they lived together. Then the next chapter goes on to list all of the land that was given to and separated among Ephraim and West Manasseh and its specific boundaries. However, the Canaanites were not driven out, but were instead sentenced to slavery. Gee, God really doesn't seem to be all that great at keeping his promise of driving out all the squatters on his real estate. However, the half-tribe of Ephraim of the children of Joseph complained to Joshua that their brother tribe Manasseh had been given much more land than them on the east of the Jordan, and they had only been given one lot of land to share. So Joshua told the children of Moses to just go clear some land from the Perizzites, that is, if they were man enough, but they said that the Canaanites there were strong and had iron chariots. Iron chariots, God's kryptonite. Joshua told them to quit their complaining and go conquer the mountain land and drive out the Canaanites, no matter how strong they are. But as we learn later in Judges, they failed. Wow, God really isn't as powerful as he seems to think he is. The remaining 7 tribes did not have any land yet, so Joshua sent 3 surveyors from each tribe to divide the land into 7 parts, and so the men cataloged their survey in a book. When they returned to Shiloh, Joshua cast lots for the land and divided it among the 7 remaining tribes. It was a lot. But the Israelites still did not have any inheritance. #Justice for Levites. The book then takes almost 2 pages to state the borders and the cities. Was a map too impossible for God to provide? Come on. Of all the tribes of Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, but for Simeon only the cities were listed because they shared land with Judah. Also, the tribe of Dan's borders were too tiny, so they just went and slaughtered Lashem to dwell there. Joshua was then given his inheritance in the form of his own city, Timnath-Serah, where he built in Mount Ephraim. So the division of the land was officially over. Then, at God's command, Israel appointed 3 cities of refuge on each side of the Jordan, but for some reason the chapter feels the need to explain what they were for, like for the 4th time by now. Then, at the command of the Lord, a total of 48 cities from the surrounding tribes were made into common land for the Levites to dwell in, because they were not given any possessions, #Justice for Levites. And the chapter, of course, takes the time to list how everything was distributed amongst the Levites and which tribes gave up which common land in exquisite detail for 38 verses. So the Lord had finally fulfilled his promise and gave the Israelites the land that he had sworn to give them, and the land was at peace because all their enemies were dead, well, except for the ones that Israel failed to kill that were talked about before. Then the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh that set up shop east of the Jordan were allowed to return to their lands by Joshua because they had fulfilled their duties in reclaiming the Holy Land, but they were warned not to rebel against the Lord and keep his commandments. So after Joshua blessed them, he sent them off with a big boatload of war booty, but after returning, they built a big altar by the east side of the Jordan. When Israel heard of it, they totally freaked out because no altar was to be built other than the Lord's altar, so Israel was ready to go to war with the eastern tribes so that God would not punish the whole assembly. However, Phinehas the priest went to meet with the eastern tribes, along with the rulers of the other tribes, and condemned them for their actions, saying that the Lord would be pissed for their rebellion. The eastern tribes explained themselves and said that because they were separated from the Lord's altar by the Jordan River, and they feared that their descendants would forget the Lord, they made the altar to remember the Lord, and nothing was to be sacrificed on it that might offend God. So Phinehas and the leaders of the other tribes chilled the hell out and declared peace, and the altar was dedicated as a covenant with the Israelites to not betray God. Then Phinehas and his company returned to the west of the Jordan. So by this point Joshua was super old and gathered all of Israel together and told them that the Lord had fought for them and had expelled their enemies before them, most of them anyway, and with God on their side, one man could exceed the power of 1,000 enemies. So they had better not disobey his law and follow other gods, nor shall they mingle and intermarry with those of other nations, or they will be corrupted. Non-Jews will not replace us! Non-Jews will not replace us! If Israel strayed from the path, they would be scourged and defeated by their enemies. Then Joshua spoke of how everything good the Lord spoke of had come to pass, but that all the evil that the Lord prophesied would also come against them when they would inevitably rebel, and they would quickly perish. Then Joshua gathered the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and recounted the history of the Israelites from Abraham all the way up to the present, and told them to fear the Lord and serve him, for he had brought them into a land of prime real estate, where they could just take all the previous inhabitants' stuff without making any of it themselves. After slaughtering them all, of course. The Israelites declared that they would never again betray the God of their fathers, wink wink, but Joshua said that God was a jealous God and would punish them brutally for their future transgression. In the end, Joshua made a covenant with the people to serve the Lord, wrote it down in a book. A stone by the sanctuary of the Lord would serve as a witness to it. Wait, what? Then Joshua died at 110 years old and was buried, as were the bones of Joseph brought out of Egypt, and Eleazar the son of Aaron, who had died. The end. Tune in next week for the Book of Judges, arguably the most violent and gruesome book in the entire Bible. I, for one, can't wait.